Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our annual review of the Presidency. My name is Ramu Nagapan. I'm the Director of the Humanities and Education Department at UC Berkeley Extension. And we are the co-presenters of this event, along with the Institute of Governmental Studies and the Robert T. Matsui Center for Politics and Public Service, as well as the Cal Democrats. So for 34 years, we've been putting together this event, and we're proud to have been part of it for all that time. As always, we're incredibly lucky to have a great group of people here on our panel, and we have no shortage of topics to cover, given all the domestic and international developments over the last year. A couple program notes. At one point, you're going to receive an index card. We encourage you to write questions on there. We'll collect them when we have a moment, and then we'll try and address as many of those questions as we can at the end of the session. Also wanted to draw your attention to another program that's on the back of this printed thing here. On May 7th, Lord Patten will be speaking on U.S.-UK relations. He's currently the Chancellor of Oxford University and was the former governor of Hong Kong. So it'll be a great event. We encourage you to come. It'll be in the same room next week. So now I'd like to say a few words of introduction for our moderator tonight, Ethan Rarick. Ethan is the Associate Director of IGS and Director of the Matsui Center. He's a former political journalist. He's author of a number of important books and editor of 3 books on politics and history. He's a frequent commentator on all of these topics and has written for many publications, including the LA Times and California History. So without further ado, Ethan.
Thank you very much, Ron. Thank you all for coming. So I'm going to start with very brief introductions of the panelists. Longer introductions are in your programs. I hope you have those. And then we'll start talking about the president. So next to me is Kathy Decker, who's the national politics editor of the Los Angeles Times. Kathy writes and edits state and national political coverage, including a Sunday political column. She also posts frequently on the Times Politics Now blog. She's covering her 10th presidential campaign and directed the Times coverage of the 2012 presidential race. She's also covered a host of U.S. Senate and California gubernatorial elections. Next to Kathy is Tom Mann, who is now a resident scholar at the Institute of Governmental Studies here at Berkeley and also a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. Tom had a long affiliation with Brookings, during which he became known as one of the most distinguished and astute observers of Washington and national politics. He's taught at many universities and published widely. He's written a series of books with his colleague Norman Ornstein, including most recently The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. And even more recently, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. Don't be too optimistic, Tom. In 2012, Foreign Policy magazine named Tom as one of the top 100 global thinkers for, quote, diagnosing America's political dysfunction. Next to Tom is Ann O'Leary, who is co-founder of the Opportunity Institute, which houses the Too Small to Fail campaign, focusing on the importance of early brain development and also other educational issues all the way through higher education. She has a long history of work in a variety of domestic policy issues. She held a variety of positions in the Clinton administration. She was legislative director for Senator Hillary Clinton. She headed a center here at our Berkeley Law School on health, economics, and family security. More recently worked with Next Generation, a policy organization created by businessman and philanthropist Tom Steyer. Most recently of all, just within the last 2 or 3 weeks, I'd say, she was named one of the top 3 policy advisors for the Hillary Clinton 2016 campaign. So Ann's going to be very busy for the next year and a half. And on the end, to your right, appropriately placed ideologically, is Stephen Hayward, who is the Ronald Reagan Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Public Policy. He previously had long affiliations with both the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and with the Pacific Research Institute right here in the Bay Area. He writes frequently for many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. He posts daily on the Powerline blog, and he is the author of 6 books, including a 2-volume chronicle of the Reagan era entitled The Age of Reagan. So I think we have a terrific panel tonight. So as I always do at this event, I encourage the panelists to sort of jump in and interact. I want you to have a conversation among yourselves as much as waiting for questions from me. But let me start with this, and I'll ask Tom to begin, and then we'll just see where we go from there. As I was thinking about the sort of public narratives about President Obama over the last year and going forward for the rest of his time in office, it seems to me that there are two competing narratives. One is that he is the classic sort of lame duck. He's facing a hostile Republican Congress. He's been unable to do anything really since Republicans took control of Congress. The political world is beginning to focus on the 2016 campaign. And so he is both doing very little and is likely to do less as time goes on. The other, though, is that he has used his executive authority to kind of circumvent Congress and to do things. I'm thinking here of things like immigration reform to some degree, minimum wage. He's used that executive authority to bypass Congress and actually do things. And that, ironically, the 2016 election, the 2014 election, freed him up to be a more vigorous advocate for the things he really believes in. And we saw a more vigorous agenda out of the State of the Union speech. So that portrays the president as an active president doing things and advocating an even more vigorous agenda in his last 2 years in office. So I guess my question is sort of, which is it? Is he a weak, lame duck, unable to do anything, or is he actually managing to get some things done?
Yes.
That's a very Washington answer.
I mean, I think this guy ought to just pack it in, right? He could begin fundraising for his presidential library and his policy center at the University of Chicago. It's all over, you know. We have an important, enlightening campaign underway. All attention is turning to 2016. Not. I don't believe that for a moment. It's important, I think, to really understand and recognize the political cycle through which we've come through over the last years of the Obama administration. The first 2 years were the time of crisis with the economy, of extraordinary achievements from the initial stimulus and financial package through the Affordable Care Act and Dodd-Frank financial reform, with many other smaller pieces in between, followed by a 2010 election that put the Republicans in the majority, which, given the orientation of our politics and of the Republican Party now toward Obama, meant that there would be no new major congressional legislative achievements. That was the name of the game. He may have been a little slow to pick up on this. Hope springs eternal when you run for the White House as a little-known person saying, we are not a nation of red states and blue states. We are the United States of America. I mean, his whole banner was about a post-partisan era, and he really either believed it or he was intensely cynical and instrumental, because it worked well in the election, but alas, it ended the day of his inauguration. So significant historic achievements in the first 2 years, followed by a period of really crucial efforts to preserve what he had achieved through 55 votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but more serious efforts to really nullify much of what he had accomplished. Reminded me of John C. Calhoun, sort of antebellum nullification strategies. He was not a real American. He was not a legitimate president. What he was doing was radical, and it had to be undone. There was never any hint of any interest or incentives to actually negotiate on anything in the first years, and over time, only when there were reasons for the Republicans as well as the Democrats to come together. The most significant in this year was the so-called Medicare doc fix. And there will be others. Trade is a classic policy where Democratic presidents advance proposals that their party hates, and Republicans make it possible for them to be achieved. So we'll have things like this, but the reality is the most important thing that he's done since the 2010 election is win the 2012 election, because without having won that, there was a good chance of much of what he achieved in the first 2 years to be undone, undermined, if not outright repealed. It now has a longer time to gestate, like the Affordable Care Act, and the odds are a Republican victory in 2016, if it were to happen, would be a unified Republican government, but and with ambitions as outlined by the candidates that are radical by American standards, but the odds are there'd be blowback from trying to do much to the achievements that he's actually realized. So my view is that, in fact, he will probably go down as being a very significant president, that this year, as he talked about at the White House Correspondents' Dinner with his bucket list of achievements in immigration and clean air, climate change, and the rest, it will be active, it will be aggressive, some of it rhetorical, looking toward the election, others administrative, really accomplishing ends that would have been impossible without him in office. So if I can't say yes, and I have to pick one, I'd pick the sort of unleashed side of that choice.
And there's a lot there, and I want to let other people pick up on stuff. But let me ask you this: there has been a lot of discussion of Obama ruling by executive authority. Some people think too much so. Some people think it's the only way he can get anything done. Do you believe that he has done substantial things by bypassing Congress, or is too much being made of that?
I do believe he's done some extensive things, and the handwriting was on the wall. John Podesta led an effort at the Center for American Progress to really look at the law and the history and the possibilities of acting administratively, and that was always intended to be a big part of the agenda of the second term, as long as Republicans held at least one House of Congress. There wasn't anything to be achieved, although try they did on immigration with success in the Senate, but not in the House. So yeah, I think it's significant. In the arena of foreign policy, he's got more leeway. Even if the Corker bill passes, say without amendment, it doesn't really constrain his efforts to try to achieve some kind of an agreement with the Iranians to constrain the growth of their nuclear weapons capacity. Is it unconstitutional? I've written about this. No, I think it's well in the tradition of executives, and I note that this is one of those matters where your views on whether one branch is too powerful depends on who controls it. It's amazing how good a predictor that is of principled positions on the Constitution.
I suspect Stephen is going to, I saw you nodding your head, and Stephen looking a little dismayed. I think you think that he's done too much by executive authority.
No, I'll surprise you on this. Let me wrap it in your larger question, though, about unleashed or lame duck. The conventional wisdom about second-term presidents is second terms are always terrible. There's either a scandal or things go badly for you, or sometimes both. And right now, there's a few controversies rumbling along. The Benghazi thing goes on forever, and the IRS stuff. None of that really reaches Obama, I don't think. Very unlikely. I don't see anything else on the horizon. And his approval ratings right now they're not great, but not bad. They're kind of like the economy, right? It's sort of okay. We wish it were better. And right now, if I were a betting person, I'd say he's going to get out of town sort of okay. Now, this question on his, the real question is this his executive assertion. And here I think he's being very bold and very hazardous, and I kind of admire him for it, actually. I don't like most of his ideas. Let's lay that out. Don't need it right, fine. But I kind of admire the way he is going about it for a couple of reasons, and I think it's very risky for him. I mean, it's possible he's going to lose some court challenges. The EPA Clean Air Plan is it's going to be challenged in court. I think it will hold up, but that's not a certainty. The immigration plan has got a federal district judge with a pretty strong opinion right now holding it up, and there's a few other legal challenges like that. But there's certain other things he's done. I'll just give you one example. So in the first term, you had this controversy when the National Labor Relations Board tried to stop Boeing from opening one of its new plants in South Carolina. Obama was asked about this. He says, well, they're an independent agency. I don't control them. Never mind that he appoints the majority of the board, but narrowly speaking, he's right about that. Now fast forward to this term and think about net neutrality. The FCC, which is notionally much more independent than the NLRB, they were well known to be skeptical of net neutrality idea. I don't have a firm opinion on this, but I think I'm going to flip the old 60s slogan, don't trust anyone over 30 with the internet. But well, what happened? It's now sort of well known that the White House put enormous pressure on the FCC to do a plan that they thought about in the White House. So Obama is now asserting greater executive authority over these independent agencies. I'll be slightly geek out on old stuff here. I'm one of those, actually there's a lot of people who think across the political spectrum that the old Humphreys executors case in the early 30s was wrongly decided, and that, in fact, presidents ought to have more direct authority, and that these so-called independent agencies should be less independent. I've thought that for a long time. So I kind of like that he's doing all this, but of course remember that will set a precedent for the next president who might be a Republican, and then I'll wonder how many liberals who like what Obama's now like it when a Republican president does the same thing and cites Obama as his authority.
Do you want to, Ann? Do you want to get in on this sort of
I'll
general
add
question?
a few things.
Yeah.
I think I would say outright, the president has a tremendous amount of authority and still a tremendous amount of control and power in a whole number of areas. So I'll just kind of tick off 4. So one is, going back to a couple of things that Tom said, is that let's look at just what's happening in the news today. This potential agreement with Iran is historical, and it's a very big deal, and it's something that really takes the President of the United States to be able to do it. Obviously, John Kerry plays a big role, but I think that is something that, if that gets done, that is something that will be very much a piece of the history of the Obama administration. I think the conversation we're having in this country about trade right now and trade policy is also very, very large and powerful. And so those 2 pieces alone would make you suggest this is not a lame duck president. This is somebody who continues to make not only history, important foreign policy, important global economic policy. So that's one bucket. The second bucket is, I think what's happening with Congress right now is fascinating. So I think, the fact of the matter is that in 2015, we now finally gotten a bill to the President of the United States that he signed, which is this Medicare doc fix, but it also included the reauthorization of the Children's Health Insurance Program, millions of kids now being covered. And so that type of domestic policy, I think, is going to continue. The Congress is now debating the No Child Left Behind bill, the education bill on K through 12 education, passed out of the Senate Health, Education, and Labor Committee, is going to go to the Senate floor. I suspect we'll see that come to the president's desk. So I think that because we have a unified Republican Congress, there's more pressure for the Republicans to kind of come together. Obviously, the Senate and the House are in slightly different positions, but I think that there's some interesting conversations going on there. So I think there'll be a lot more opportunity for Obama to sign bills. And then I will say, in terms of his executive power, that is a tremendous authority. And I think Stephen's right. Whether you like it or not, it's very significant. So let's just take one specific example, which is the example of federal contracting. So what the president is doing through his federal contracting power is basically saying, if you're a federal contractor, we're going to put certain rules on you. So one example is the issue of the minimum wage, but there's many others. And I think what some people don't understand is that these requirements aren't just for the individuals who have a federal contract, but if you're an employer who takes a federal contract, your entire workforce then is covered by this executive authority. And so it's about 25% of the American workforce actually is impacted by these federal contracting executive executive orders. And so I think that that's a very significant power that will be interesting to see what happens. Obviously, if we have a change in parties, then a lot of these would be overturned. But if we don't, that would continue on, one would assume, under the next president. So I think that's a very big deal. And then I would say that one thing that we don't often talk about is, you know, his State of the Union address. A lot of people talked about it as, oh, well, he's setting it up for whoever's running for, there's somebody running for president on the other side, whoever may be running for president on the other side.
Who will the nominee be? Gee.
The nominee. But one of the things I think is fascinating is that there's a lot of people listening to the State of the Union, and it's not just the potential nominee. It's governors, it's mayors, and so, you know, let's just give one specific example, which is the issue of universal preschool. It's an issue that I've worked on a long time. President Obama has made this a very big deal. He made it a big deal in the previous State of the Union, and then this State of the Union talked a lot about child care. Well, I was fascinated to see that in this January 2015, he'd done universal preschool in January 2014. Well, in January 2015, 9 Republican governors in their State of the State talked about universal preschool. Now, that's a big deal because basically he's agenda setting, and he's not only agenda setting, you know, people make a big deal that Congress isn't moving on universal preschool. It's true, Congress isn't moving, but the states are feeling extraordinary pressure to do something in this issue. So I think that his bully pulpit power doesn't just extend to Congress, but it also extends to all the other leaders in our country who are listening. So I would say that Obama is fully kind of barreling through his second term in very, very powerful and historic ways.
And, Kathy, there's some stuff I want to pick up on there, but Kathy, do you want to talk about either this question of how vigorous is he in the second term as you see it, and then also Stephen mentioned his approval ratings, which are, I looked those up today at the analogous point. He's far more popular than George Bush, or W. Bush was, less popular than Bill Clinton. He's about the same as Reagan was at this point.
Exactly.
So do you see him sort of getting out of town okay, as Stephen put it?
I mean, I think one of the things about being a lame duck president is that you're only a lame duck president until the next bomb goes off in an important place or something big happens. I mean, I think all of us remember Bill Clinton having to get up at the podium and saying, you know, I'm really, you know, important still. And he had to say that because people didn't think he was, or a lot of people didn't think he was. And a day or so later, Oklahoma City blows up, and he is the consoler in chief, and immediately, you know, his numbers are going up. Now, obviously, nobody hopes that sort of thing will happen, but as Ann talked about the Iran deal, I mean, there are things that will keep him, we only have one president. There are things that are going to keep him at the top of the heap until the very end. And so that, you know, guarantees a legitimacy and a chance for him to be seen in a better way. I think the question that we don't know about Obama is that people, with the exception of George W. Bush, we haven't seen presidents operate in this polarized, highly polarized time and seen what happens to the vision of them 20 years down the road. I mean, nobody would have thought that Bill Clinton would be the most popular politician in the country in the middle 90s because he was either flailing around or playing around or whatever. And there was, you know, there was
pretty
a lot
much
of
the same thing. Yeah.
But he, you know, but look who was called out to rescue Democrats in 2012 in some places and in 2014. It was Bill Clinton, just for the sheer power of what he represented to people. And I think we don't know, you know, he operated, it was hard to see at the time because it seemed very polarized at the time, but I would argue that now is more polarized. Views of our political figures are more set into concrete, and what we don't know is 20 years out, will Obama be seen with a gentler eye than he is right now, or are the views that people have right now going to stay that way because everyone is more set in their ways?
Mm-hmm. But the polarization thing is interesting because, Ann, I think if I heard you correctly, you think that actually the Republican takeover of the Senate, and thus a unified Republican Congress, has ironically produced a Congress, did I hear it correctly, more likely to be productive because they can't appear to be just stonewalling.
I think there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the Republican leadership to get things done. Now, of course, you know, we were talking beforehand. There's obviously great dysfunction, and I don't say this as a partisan, but I think just objectively there's some dysfunction in the Republican Party, which is that it spans quite a diverse ideological spectrum right now, and I think that makes it hard for people like Speaker Boehner, frankly, who has the hardest job of any politician in America, frankly, to deal with the range of opinions in his House party. But regardless of that, I think that there is a lot of pressure on him and on Mitch McConnell to make sure that they can get bills done and to get things out. So let's go back to the example I used of No Child Left Behind. They tried to pass it in the House, and they ended up flailing around and not being able to get anything done, and people thought, okay, this is all over. Well, the Senate has some very effective bipartisan leadership in Lamar Alexander, a senator from Tennessee who's a former Secretary of Education, and Patty Murray, a senator from Washington State. The two of them are incredibly good legislators, incredibly bipartisan spirited, and so they were able to ably get that bill unanimously out of the Senate Help Committee and now onto the Senate floor. I think once the Senate passes it, there's then this pressure on the House to not act so crazy and to be less radical and to try to get something done. So I think there's going to be this interesting kind of conversation between the two legislative bodies that will result in legislation, but this is the expert here, so maybe he'll
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, is your next book going to be It's Slightly Less Worse Than It Used to Look? I think that's Anne's argument.
No, it's already entitled Run for the Hills. No, there will be and have been circumstances where Republicans have incentives to work out some deals on some things. Not because they have a new view of Obama and his agenda and the Democrats, not because they consider lawmaking to be their highest priority right now, but they're legitimate incentives pushing them to set aside, in some areas, their sort of unified opposition and to engage. And if you look in each case, the Medicare doc fix and reauthorizing No Child Left Behind, each has some problematic aspects to it for both parties that they kind of like to get away from. You know, the Republicans are worried to death about Common Core and some of the elements that have become very unpopular in the Republican Party of that legislation. And Democrats have been willing to deal on that. And similarly, dealing with the doc fix now just made sense for the leadership. And once Boehner feels he has room and has the incentives, he can cut deals with Pelosi. They're both superb politicians who can do it. What I would say is that those are the exceptions, that it's not, it's mainly driven by the politics of each issue that comes up, that the baseline is still the Republican Party is in opposition. It is a parliamentary style opposition party whose presidential candidates may differ here and there in little bits, but basically agree on a radical agenda that if they control both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, will, like a newly elected parliamentary government, try to put it into place. That's the objective, and therefore, you know, they're not too motivated by making laws now. Look how long the infrastructure bill, if ever there was a simple matter to deal with and a need in the country, it was that, and yet we're still struggling with that. We have huge battles on appropriations and the debt ceiling again. It will be difficult to deal with those. We've got deadlines coming up on things that have to be passed, like a reauthorization of the Patriot Act. There's some other cybersecurity matters. So yes, they can get things done on a few specifics, but the broad picture, if anything, has been reinforced. And we saw it with a hardball on Loretta Lynch, and the politics of a trafficking bill that frankly was a pretty minor bill and does relatively little, but took on a new meaning because we fought out the politics of funding abortions on that again. So no, I don't think the party has changed one bit. Their overall incentives, it's just that even in this world of intense partisan war, strategic behavior, there still are going to be opportunities to get a few things done.
Stephen, when Ann said the Republican Party covers a broad spectrum ideology, I saw you sort of blanch.
No, I wasn't. Oh no, that was if that was, it was an ironic blanch because I was in heated agreement with what she was saying. This is, you tend to get these cliches and stereotypes. It's all just people who they can't even bother to put away their Klan robes, as the way the parties often described these days is sort of kind of silly, I think. And the parties are more ideologically homogeneous. This has been a long-term trend that's gone on. I think. It's interesting, though, that Ann mentioned No Child Left Behind and the reauthorization of it. There's been much on my mind lately about the original No Child Left Behind. That's the last major piece of new legislation. The things you all both mentioned are reauthorizations of things we already have, and there's some controversies with that. But No Child Left Behind was the last piece of a new idea that passed in the old-fashioned way. By the way, everybody seems to hate No Child Left Behind. We used to call that compromise, a piece of legislation. Everybody got a little of what they wanted, and nobody got all of what they wanted, and we lived with it, and we'll fight another day about fixing it up and changing it, right? And now that's really hard to do with something new. And I think you guys might know the numbers. The members, there's been so much turnover in the House and Senate that we have, it's a minority now who are still around from No Child Left Behind.
Yeah,
so one of the flip sides, I don't want to talk about this a long time, but although it deserves a long consideration, is the flip side of Obama's reassertion, or he's not the first guy to, especially do executive agreements the way he's doing them with foreign nations and so forth, to a higher stage, I think, which we can talk about. But the flip side of this is I think there's been, and I think Tom might agree with this in certain ways, there's been this long enfeeblement, a self-enfeeblement of Congress that's been going on for more than 50 years. And I know there are at least some Republicans who think, and this is part of their beef with Harry Reid, but it's also with other things, that we need to get back to what the geeks call the regular order. Let's actually get the committee system working again so everything isn't decided by the leaders and the White House cutting a deal and then ordering their members to vote for it, which you can do maybe in the House but not in the Senate at all. But they don't really know how to do it. And a lot of the new people have never experienced that.
Yeah.
And that whether they're Tea Party people or just ordinary Chamber of Commerce Republicans, they've never done that. And getting that back is really hard. And I'm sure that even the ones who say they want to do this, I'm not sure they know how to do it, and they're stumbling around. And I'm not hugely optimistic, but at least there's some recognition. And I think in this respect, the anger, their dislike of Obama is a good thing in this sense. It's making Congress stand up for its branch the way Madison said they should in Federalist 51.
I just want to say one thing about that because I think it's so fascinating. I had this experience, and I won't say who it is, but a very senior who'd been there for quite some time, a congressperson, came to see me maybe a year and a half ago, and the person said to me, we really need something for our freshman our Congress people to do. And I said, what do you mean you need something for them to do? And he said, well, they think they've come to Washington to legislate, and we don't actually do that anymore.
Yes,
and
exactly.
So we really, you're running this national initiative on early childhood, and this is a great thing for them to talk to their constituents about, and it's great because it doesn't require legislation, and you can get them, acting as your spokespeople in your local their local communities, and they're really great leaders and very diverse, freshman class, but we don't have anything for them to do in Washington, so it'd be great if you could get them to do this. And I found it so strange, but then so true. It's, really, so I think there's a longing, in both parties to say, how do we get back to this time in which there was very serious matters in which you're legislating and having hearings, and those hearings actually led to real congressional action, and you really had, I was talking to a former colleague today, I worked on No Child Left Behind, I was Senator Clinton's legislative director at the time, and it really was a moment. We worked closely with Boehner's staff, and obviously with Kennedy, and Judd Gregg was the Republican senator. And we really did truly have a committee, coming together. I think that's you beeping.
Tom wins the booby prize.
I shut it off. Sorry.
No
Bad
problem.
Tom.
But there was a time in which legislation was happening and you came together with real agreements. And I think that it's true that you know, for the past 10 or plus years, that hasn't happened. And so I think there is this longing, you know, no matter what party you're in, if you're about good public policy, of trying to figure out how to make this happen again.
And how much of this is, do we have the wrong kind of parties for the American system? Tom, you've written about this, so you want to, I mean, we used to have really ideologically diverse parties, right, extending from very conservative Southern Democrats to liberal Northeastern Democrats and Republican parties, same thing. We now have ideologically consistent parties that are much more like a European parliamentary system.
Exactly. And
is the system just inherently broken because we've got the wrong style of political party?
There are virtues to that. I mean, there's much more clarity for the electorate. There's a possibility of more substantive accountability with that. But the requirement is, in our political system, which is not parliamentary and in which the presidency is not like the prime minister and has a majority, a single party or a coalition to put his program through, it requires a willingness to engage in negotiations and compromise. So in my view, it's better to have the parties more distinctive with some views. I don't think all wisdom resides at the center point between two partisan poles. What you need is a willingness to receive and consider new information, where everything isn't driven by the priors that you bring into the process, where you consider the other party a legitimate player in the democratic process. Under those circumstances, you might be able to make do with more ideologically distinct parties. As difficult as that kind of parties make it, so too do very competitive parties make it difficult to govern. Because since 1994, we've had both houses of Congress really up for grabs in every election. We didn't have that. Democrats used to think it was a birthright to be in the majority. They control the House for 40 straight years, and if you take it back to 1930, they won only 2 Congresses before 1994. But it's different. It's different now, and with that possibility of winning control or losing control of the majority, and with the more distinctive ideological views and interest group alignments, the stakes are higher. And so you get much more strategic behavior. Even when you really agree with what, say, the president is doing, and you supported it 2 years earlier, now that he's for it, you're against it. So there's a lot of behavior like that. So it's the competitiveness of polarized parties in a constitutional system where so much power is divided, where there's so many veto points, where supermajority requirements constrain efforts of majorities to govern. It's very difficult to govern. Now, I put on top of that, I mean, we're all good friends here and so on, but I have to put the other one out, which is that the Republicans make it more difficult because they're the ones not inclined to compromise now. It's just the nature of their constituencies and their media and everything else, while Democrats, partly because they like government and are willing to cut deals to keep it going, are just inclined naturally to cut deals. Not everyone in the Democratic Party. There is a left, that objects to fighting the trade deal and certain kinds of, are you really going to ban GMOs in California? I mean, what's going on here? So there, I'm not saying there aren't excesses, but the fact is, with one party so sort of absolutist and doctrinaire and oppositional, it just makes it very hard for the system to operate constructively.
Do you see, Kathy, I'm curious, do you see, writing about covering politics, do you see the Republicans as being more set in stone than the Democrats? Are they less willing to compromise, or is that just their current role? And then we're going to let
I mean, I think if you have a Democratic president, the Republicans are going to be seen as not compromising, and if you have a Republican president, the Democrats are probably going to be seen as not compromising. But I think you touched on something that I think is really sort of important to the whole global conversation about partisanship and who's the bad guy here, which is that 30 years ago, we didn't have separate ecosystems in which each side could live happily, never having to confront the other from birth till death. And now we do. And so that sort of all of the factors, to go to what you were talking about, wishing that it could be the way it used to be, all the factors in play, it seems to me, fight that. You have very few, compared to historically, very few competitive districts, so you don't have the imperative for an office holder to, sort of hit the middle. You have, Fox News on the left and Huffington Post and MSNBC, right? Didn't mean that. Roger Ailes. But everybody can go to their corners and stay there comfortably and hear reinforcements of their own beliefs and never be challenged in the way that, when television was a much smaller thing, when there wasn't an internet to allow you to find resources that you agreed with, that, when you were essentially forced at 6:30 every night to listen to both sides in the evening news, to be archaic, all of that's gone. And so I think it makes it much harder to get people to a center point, not ideologically so much as agreement-wise. I'll give you this, you give me that, we'll all go home happy, which is what, some of it used to be.
Yeah. Stephen, what I hear Kathy talking about is a sort of equal polarization in which both sides have moved apart. Tom has written often about an uneven polarization in which Republicans have moved much more to the right than Democrats have and have become more obstinate. I'm curious how you see that.
I'll have a complicated view. I think there's equal polarization, but it's asymmetric in some important ways. No, this is not my first rodeo with Tom.
That's why we like one another so much.
I had this splendid debate with his partner in crime, Norm Ornstein, a couple of years, and the resolution was, are the Republicans an extremist party? And my answer was, I was supposed to be no. I said, no, I certainly hope so. I mean, they began as an extremist party in the 1850s, and the Supreme Court declared their platform unconstitutional. So what's new about where they are today? Now, I exaggerate a little bit for effect. But what Catherine brings up is, I think, two parts to this. The quick part where I think we can reach fairly considerable agreement. I mean, Alan Abramowitz of Emory, a very liberal political scientist, does some really good modeling on elections. He and I argue about everything. We're in heated agreement that one defect right now is partisan gerrymandering. Candidates and parties get to pick their voters. And that, I actually could cite examples and walk through why when you don't have that, the Iowa model, certain others. I think California in the 1990s in the legislature, when you had special masters to the districts here, irrespective of the voting, but geographical, I think you had better political functioning in a state that's been pretty polarized. I don't think polarization's that new. I think the scale of it is larger, but I think that correlates with the scale and size and reach of government. Look, the Congress of 46 to 48 that Harry Truman ran against, that was a confrontational Congress. They passed Taft-Hartley over his veto. And then, of course, Truman famously runs against the do-nothing Congress and wins in what really is a referendum election. Reagan had a lot of deference from the Democrats, but they drew the line here and there. Tip O'Neill puts out the order in the spring of 1981. No Democrat may cooperate with Republicans on any discussion of Social Security reform. And if you do, you will lose your committee assignments and you will have no help from the party in your reelection. Well, now it's done across the board on a lot of stuff. But look, so the New Deal, the height of the New Deal, the government was, 10, 12% of GDP. Now it's 24%. In the New Deal era, sure, we got a lot of new stuff. NLRB, Security Exchange Commission, go on down the list of the New Deal agencies. But now we have so many more things to fight about. There's the EPA. This is a big fight, right, over all those things. And some of the old NLRB is a fight, right? And so when you have parties that are now more ideologically coherent, and the government is bigger, I think that this is just inevitable that this is going to happen. Now, Democrats, as the party of government, I hope nobody's offended if I say that. It's not an insult, really. That's where the asymmetry comes in, right? And Republicans take their ideology more seriously now. Whereas in the old days, I mean, again, about the Reagan years, this is when it started to change, but I sort of counted up the Senate, because Republicans take the Senate. But I counted at least 16 moderate to liberal Republican senators when Reagan came in, many of whom were the keys in blocking some of the things he wanted to do. Not Democrats. It was Republicans who stood in his way. Well, now you're down to two maybe, yeah, right? And you had some conservative Democrats you mentioned, but that was you still had Rockefeller Republicans then. Now there are almost none except in museums and country clubs in New York.
Graveyards.
Yes, there too, right?
But let me ask you this, and I'll just sort of throw it to the whole panel. So I hear you talking about a very broken system, a very polarized system, a system in which the parties are very ideologically consistent, operating in a system with a lot of veto points. So a very broken political system. But at the beginning, I think I heard all of you say that you see Obama as a strong, historic, I think somebody used the word historic, successful president, and not just from the first 2 years when Democrats controlled Congress, that he has managed to do things. So is Obama somehow sort of underrated? Has he operated in this very broken political system and actually done more than we give him credit for? Or if not, what is the explanation for a historic, substantial presidency in the midst of a horribly broken system?
I think some of the history of his presidency, the historic nature of it, occurred the day he was elected. He didn't have to even get up and go to work the next day to achieve that. I mean,
He had
seriously.
a Nobel on the second day.
Right.
I mean, really, I mean,
To be the
a
first
lot
African American.
of right,
Right.
a lot of the. It seems to me that there's sort of a division between the people who liked the idea of Obama and what he represented and what they saw in him, and what he represented exists, whether he passes Obamacare or doesn't pass Obamacare, whether he, and then there's sort of the different and somewhat Venn diagram overlapping group of people that believed what he said when he was running and expected him to achieve it all, and then he's thrust into this environment of dysfunction and Republican majorities in the Senate and the House at different times, and doesn't get some of it done, and they think he's not quite so good anymore. So there is I think that a lot of what you think of him, and whether you think that he is historic and successful, or whether you think that he's historic and mildly successful, depends on sort of why it was you wanted him in the first place, or accepted him in the first place.
Yeah, but, you know, I think that's right. I think that's interesting. But I also think that he's not really given credit for how well he has figured out how to deal in this system. So I think there's two issues I'd put on the table in addition to what Kathy said, which I wholeheartedly agree with. So one is that, you know, he came into an economy that was plummeting. And it's hard to get credit when often you look at what's happening and people say, well, you know, my income is still stagnant, my costs are still rising. And the fact of the matter is, it would have been a heck of a lot worse if Obama hadn't stabilized the economy. So in some sense, I think he doesn't get credit because it's hard to get credit for saying, well, it'd be a lot worse. It'd be much, much worse if, you know, we hadn't done these things. So because people see that there's still some, you know, problems. We still have work to do in the economy. So I would say that that's, kind of one bucket. But the second bucket I think is really interesting is that I think he has figured out how to maneuver in a pretty dysfunctional system. So, you know, the fact that he passed the Affordable Care Act, particularly, you know, when, God bless Ted Kennedy, when Ted Kennedy passed away and suddenly we had Scott Brown and they still got it over the finish line, I think was really quite phenomenal. And, you know, there's still a story to be told. I don't know what's going to happen in the Supreme Court in June with King versus Burwell and whether we're going to see a lot of the Affordable Care Act overturned or at least upended in some certain ways. But I think that that's been very significant. But I also think the way that and you're right, there's been others examples of presidents that have used the pen effectively with regard to executive orders and used the power of the phone and the bully pulpit. But he really has very, very strongly been able to do this. He's been encouraged, he's been literally encouraging local action. You take the minimum wage, I think is a really interesting example, is that in a number of states, minimum wage was on the ballot, and red states, blue states, every state that had the minimum wage on the ballot actually voted to increase the minimum wage. Now, they didn't vote for the candidates who were running on the minimum wage because they didn't actually think that Washington could get it done, but they wanted it to get done. And that, I think, again, is partially the setting of Obama talking about these issues, being part of this national conversation. So I would give him quite a bit of credit for both figuring out how to maneuver in a very difficult economic situation and figuring out how to maneuver in a pretty dysfunctional different system in terms of using different tools.
The other thing that he's doing, it seems to me now, that is important for 2016 is that he's essentially closing the circle on his promises from 2008. A lot of the things that didn't get accomplished because of the disagreements at the congressional level is what he's working on with executive action. And all of those things, it seems to me, that he's doing now forward into the 2016 race in a way that defines Democrats among the rising electorate that we have here. So immigration, what does that force all the Republican candidates to do? It forces them to get on the record to be against either the DREAM Act or the extension that he put through in executive action, or both. Cuba, how, as Marco Rubio, do you run as the prince of a new generation when you're defending the Cuba policy of 50 years ago? I mean, a lot of the Cuba thing reads as, we're done with the Cold War, we're moving ahead, which is precisely what Hillary Clinton beat him up for in the primaries, because she said he was going to be too accommodating to dictators who should be shunned. A lot of, it seems to me, what he is doing is really sort of reinforcing his early message, but it does play strongly to voter groups that Democrats really need in order to get a third successive term, which is historically very difficult.
I want to talk about 2016, but not quite yet. First, I want to see if Tom and Stephen want to talk about this. Does he get enough credit for operating in a broken system well?
Listen, presidents get too much credit when everything's going well. The economy's doing well, things work out in foreign policy and counter, and too much blame when it doesn't. The opportunities, the agency for presidents to do things, to lead, is really quite limited. It's constrained in our politics. It's partly the complication. The economy drives the budget more than the budget drives the economy, and it's true in many, many things. There are real limits to what you can do. And secondly, the political context, within which you're operating in these times, basically determines what's possible, what isn't, what the opportunities are, and the like. And one of my real beefs with Washington and Washington press corps, not everybody by any means, but let's say Bob Woodward, as someone who's rather well known, just the most absurd, unrealistic, banal arguments about if the president just drank bourbon and branch water more with those Republicans on the Hill, they could work out some deals. He misinterprets the basis of Lyndon Johnson's success as president and neglects his failures once everything collapsed on him and in his later years, and doesn't really, for Woodward, it's capturing the narrative and the president at the center of things. And that's not the reality of how it works. And what I would say is Obama was dealt not a bad hand at the beginning because he had a unified Democratic government, and he was close to a cloture 60 in the Senate. It took him a while to get there, and he lost it really quickly. And there was a sense of crisis and some opportunity. But he faced opposition from the very beginning, and opportunities for negotiating or deal-making were simply not present. And I suspect in the long haul, his legacy is going to be determined partly by matters out of his control. He wanted more stimulus. He couldn't get it out of a Republican Congress, and we're still slogging away at it. So how it ends depends, for him, depends on factors largely out of his control. But what I would do is agree with Ann is, given the ingredients that he faced, he's really done quite a good job, and most of the criticisms of him are kind of petty and temperamental, personality kind of things, not really what he's about. And he may be wrong on Iran, but he hasn't bungled his way on it. He's doing exactly what he thinks is the right way to deal with an existential threat, but not put the Middle East at war for decades. So, yeah, successful president.
Although on foreign affairs, the president always has far more leeway than on domestic matters, right? I mean, in that case, the presidency is closer to being at the center of things.
Political leeway to make decisions, but those decisions do not necessarily determine the outcome of the policies. Yeah.
Well, I would say, sort of work backwards a little bit, this executive agreement business on foreign policy has always been something of a gray area, and he's, I think, pushing it on a big scale. I think it'll all depend on, in Iran, if you get a good agreement that works. Remember, the Clinton framework with North Korea didn't really work for very long. And, so as I said, the larger point is 10 years from now, if the agreement's stuck and it's worked out pretty well, then that's going to be a big feather in his cap, and some other things too. By the way, I just want to add a little sidebar on this that no one remembers except antiquarians like me. When Jimmy Carter's SALT II treaty was in big trouble, this was before the invasion of Afghanistan, he floated the idea of making an executive agreement with the Soviet Union. This is when Democrats still had big majorities in the Senate and in the House. Well, the Senate, this was going to be it. And his own party was not amused and said, "Don't you dare." And that's interesting now that, so what Congress is saying now with the Corker bill is something similar to that. So here's one where he may have gone a step too far on the formal parts of it. I think any biographer or historian will tell you that it's too soon to tell, right? I think 10, 15 years when you really get more documents, more pictures, you debrief everybody. I think that, well, I'll put it this way, we pretty much know, in many cases by now, how someone's going to be regarded when they leave office. That's true of most of our presidents. There have been a few surprises, a few little things change. The one big surprise is who? It's Eisenhower, right? And by the way, it's liberals who first started appreciating Eisenhower 10 years after he left office, first of all. It's kind of interesting. And now, lately, some Republicans have. It's an interesting thing that lately have been these articles in the same magazines on the right that damned Eisenhower in the 50s now having cover stories. Yeah, actually, he was pretty good after all. And I think it's possible that Obama may end up that way a long time from now. However, I think the one mark I'm looking for now is the Obama era politically has been very good for Obama, but not for a lot of other Democrats, right? Where are Republicans now? Their highest watermark in 70 years in state legislatures, 31 governors. And it's a little hard to make out Hillary being the sole candidate to succeed him. And yeah, she's been a big figure for a long time. On the other hand, after 8 years of Reagan, he left the party in pretty good shape. You had a whole, Vice President Bush had to fight for it, and you had other nationally known figures with big followings. And if you can do a thought experiment of no Hillary to be the commanding president that she is, how do they look right now on the presidential level, the Democratic Party? I'm not sure they look all that good. Maybe they do. It's the blinding light of Hillary and the H logo and all that is making it hard to think about that very clearly. But I think that one of the things you think about just as a political matter, here's the lame duck argument, by the way. He's leaving the party very lame, possibly. And by the way, Tom, I think, yeah, you can say, what's the big deal? He doesn't drink bourbon with the other guys. But I think those things count a lot. And it's not his style, and fine, but I think some of those things will end up adding up against him.
One of the things,
even if he had to drink bourbon in a polarized environment
Right.
in which the other party is far distant from him,
Yeah.
bourbon can overcome that much.
Well, I prefer single malt whiskey myself, but I
Can I ask one question about Obamacare? It seems to me, had we been having this conversation just a year ago, people would have been saying, Obamacare is, or maybe 15 months ago, Obamacare is you know, the rollout didn't work very well, and it's a drag on the president's popularity and so forth. It seems to me in the last 6 months, more and more, it's beginning to appear that Obamacare may be far and away his biggest legacy. That it's, you know, we've seen the percentage of people without insurance drop. Even a number of Republicans have given up on the repeal stuff, not just because he would veto it, but on substantive grounds. Is Obamacare going to end up being, despite the awkwardness of the rollout and so forth, a very popular long-term legacy that he'll be remembered for decades?
Well, I'd say two things. So one, for the first time, the Kaiser Family Foundation does a tracking poll to look at the popularity of healthcare over time. And for the first time this month, Obamacare is more popular than it is unpopular. So that was a very big deal. It's not very much. It's like maybe 1 percentage point. It's probably still within the margin of error. But it went up, which I think was exciting. But the other thing that I think is important is that if you go, you know, and you ask people, and in fact, I think, you know, one of the late night funny guys did this, but there's actually real things where you go and you ask people, you know, do you think that you should be covered if you're under 26? Do you think you should be covered if you have pre-existing health conditions, so on and so forth? And everybody says yes, 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 yes. And then they say, do you support Obamacare? Oh, no way, I don't support Obamacare. So I think that people, when you break it down, they actually understand that there are the pieces of it, the components of it are very popular. I mean, people in their everyday lives experience not being able to get health insurance because they have an ill family member, or you know, all of these different things that happen to people. Their lived experience is now very different because of the consumer protection. So it's not just, which is not, I shouldn't say just, it's huge the number of people who are now covered by health insurance, but the consumer protections of people who were already covered and now have much better coverage, I think, is also a very big and historic deal. So I would say that yes, I think it's going to be seen as a lasting and critically important part of our social policy. But I think if the Supreme Court, we still have an opportunity for this to be really messed up. So for those of you who are not careful court watchers, there is a case coming down called King versus Burwell, and it's a case of statutory interpretation. And the case is a question about whether or not, when Congress wrote the bill, whether or not they intended for individuals who are purchasing health insurance on the exchanges or the marketplace, but basically people who don't have it through their employer and are getting it through what we set up as we call health exchanges, whether they could get subsidies, so they get an opportunity to get some subsidies to afford the health insurance, whether they could get those subsidies if only if the state that they were in set it up, or whether they could get it if the state decided that the federal government could set it up for them. So this is a little bit complicated, but the fact of the matter is that the way it played out is that there are very few states who set up their own state health exchange. And in fact, most states said to the federal government, we're going to let you set it up, and then our people who live in our state will be able to benefit as a result. And so there's a play now that says that those people don't actually get the subsidies. If this happens, if that's overturned, then I think we're going to be in a whole different ballgame where it really kind of begins to crumble the kind of basic infrastructure of the Affordable Care Act. So I think that it's still a little bit out until June, in which we see what's happening. But if that's upheld, then I think we're in really good, clear kind of landing power to continue on and to see this have a huge impact for decades to come.
And even Republicans, though, have started talking about if they've started talking about continuing the subsidies.
Terrified.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Short-term
The worst thing that could happen is the subsidies go away, actually. So, I mean,
Right.
doesn't that actually speak to the popularity of Obamacare in a certain sense?
It speaks to the difficulty, the greater difficulty of taking something away from people once they have it than having it be a hypothetical out in the distance somewhere that they don't know they have yet. I mean, that was part of the drive to get this thing done and passed, was the theory that, you know, once people, I mean, nobody envisioned the sort of internet and website issues that, you know, bollocksed it for some time. But the notion was that if you got millions and millions and millions of people, which they now have nationally, getting insurance for the first time, many of them, under this program that it would be politically impossible, even in the red states, which are the ones that refuse to do the state exchanges, they would have to come play ball. And that's the question of, that will be the really interesting thing to see on the outcome. It absolutely craters the foundation of Obamacare, but it also throws the ball into the fields that are controlled by Republican governors.
Yeah,
Ethan, I just wanted to say that I believe the exchanges will be upheld, and I bet it's 6-3 instead of 5-4. And I think Ann is right. The evidence of consumer satisfaction with the policy and the objective evidence on how it's doing and the reduced estimates now of cost, or real cost versus estimated cost at the beginning, all augur well for it. So, but I don't think Obamacare will be remembered by anyone. That the name, it isn't the name, as you were saying. They see things that are known by the state exchanges and the state program, and most Americans are touched theoretically, indirectly, by some of the regulatory consumer effects, but it's not like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security where everyone is touched. There's still the fact that people worry they're going to be losers from it. They have insurance, and somehow this is going to cost them something. So I think it'll be continue to be highly contested, but I think it will survive. It will eventually transform other parts of the healthcare system, and we'll probably look back on it as by far the most important achievement of his presidency.
I want to talk about the 2016 election and how Obama has sort of set us up for that election. But before I do that, let me mention to people in the audience, if you have questions, please write them on a card, pass them to the end of the aisle, hold them up. Someone will come around and get them, and in a few minutes, some of those will be brought up to me. If you write a speech, I'm not going to read it, so please actually write a question, which is short and ends with a question mark. Let's talk a little bit about the 2016 election, and I don't really want to get into a discussion of the whole election, but I'm curious about, and Stephen started talking about this with Obama, sort of the condition in which he's left the Democrats as they seek this so-called third term, or has he left open some sort of opening that Republicans can exploit, or is he going to be basically irrelevant to this election, and is the economy going to drive the presidential election, and people are going to vote based on the economy, and Obama as an individual doesn't really matter? Is he? What's going to be his role in 2016? Anybody want to?
I think it's important, not in terms of his campaigning, but in terms of how he's perceived in the country. If his approval ratings manage to work back to 50% or so, and the country's feeling pretty good about the economy, and public attitudes about that have been changing, and if there's a good sort of robust feeling about it and about him, then that's going to make it easier to turn out core Democratic constituencies. He'll appear in some heavily minority communities and in swing states and other places, but basically the election is baked into the situation of the parties right now and sort of the state of the economy, and so I don't think either Obama, separate from his standing and the perceptions of whether his presidency have been successful, the loss in the state legislatures and the governorships are entirely from midterm elections when the country was still very upset about how things were going in the country, and the turnout was 40% instead of 60%, with a real Republican advantage to that. I think right now, if anyone, Democrats have the advantage in the presidential coalitions, and if things go well, they have a well-known, strong candidate. Hillary's the only one because she's so strong and she's preempted other candidates. There are plenty of people around, but none of them believe they could win, including Elizabeth Warren. So that speaks to strength. My own view is it almost doesn't matter who the candidates are. That is, they might make a difference of 1% or 2 or 3, and maybe it's going to be that close. But assuming Hillary is the nominee and one of the known Republican candidates is the nominee, I don't think it's going to come down to a choice between 2 candidates, but it's between 2 teams. We have divided ourselves into teams, and that's mainly what it's about.
And Obama will not be the key factor in that. It's more one's affinity with one team or the other and one's feelings about the economy. Kathy, you've written about the fact that Hillary so far, and then we'll see if Ann wants to comment on this, but isn't really running sort of on Obama's record, but she's not running away from it either. She was part of the administration.
Well, she's certainly in her early, and granted it's only 2 weeks old, so anything could happen. But she has made clear that she is going to acknowledge that the Obama economy isn't all that America wants it to be, that there are cracks in it, and particularly in terms of, I probably am the only person who hates the term income inequality, but I hate it. But that sort of generalized, knotted up fear that a lot of Americans have that the floor is going to fall out again, or that their kids, to use Bill Clinton's famous 1992 thing, their kids are not going to be better off than they were. I think there's just a real tension and we've sent reporters out throughout the country in 2014 to talk about a whole bunch of issues. And everybody came back saying nobody wants to talk about that. They just want to talk about the economy and how scared they are. And that's, I think, what she's trying to address in her early goes, to say, I'm not an imperial candidate. I am listening to you. I hear your fear. And that's essentially, it seems to me, what the early go is. And then there's all sorts of different components that we haven't even gotten to yet, and you will know better than us. But there is an acknowledgement of she's saying, in effect, Obama got you this far, I will get you the rest of the way. And it's very similar to what George H.W. Bush was saying after Reagan, when he too was seeking a 3rd consecutive term, that his line was, if you're going to change horses in midstream, you might just get on one that's going in the same direction, and made that argument very successfully against Michael Dukakis. And there will be, I'm sure, echoes of that in her argument. But she's such a big political personality that it's hard, it's not like she can grab onto his, coat and run with it.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, do you see her, do you think that she is running, or do you think that people perceive, from your reporting, that people perceive her as running for Obama's 3rd term, or is that
That certainly is the Republican argument, because the other argument that they would make is that you're running for Bill Clinton's 3rd term, and Bill Clinton's a way more popular politician than Obama is right now. I mean, the reality is, as will be made clear over the course of time, is that she is running for the 3rd consecutive Democratic term, but that she's running it for her own 1st term. And if she doesn't make that case, then she's lost. But she has to define herself in a way that is separate from the previous occupant of the White House, just like everyone else has to.
And I don't want to put you on the spot on the Hillary campaign as much, but how do you see Obama?
But you're on the spot.
I will, yeah, I will. But how do you see Obama impacting this race, if at all?
Do you want to answer? Why don't you go ahead? I'll answer that.
This is the trickiest political landscape that I've ever seen and can imagine. And my crystal ball is very cloudy. Because on the one hand, you just said it, is she running for Obama's 3rd term or Bill Clinton's 3rd term? And then the other thing is that...
Or her first.
Yes.
Right. And the other thing is, there's a tricky thing for Republicans. Let's just assume, for purposes of discussion, that Obama a year from now is where he is right now. Sort of under 50, but sort of okay. And but do remember this about his reelection, though. Yes, I agree with you about the built-in democratic advantages of presidential elections. He's the first reelected president in modern times to have a lower vote total than his initial election. I mean, that was not an election where almost all reelected presidents build on their first election, and he went down by 4 or 5 million votes. That was so it was kind of a weak reelection in certain ways, mitigated by the fact that Republicans were even weaker because of their miserable campaign. So what Hillary's banking on is replicating the sort of popularity of the coalition that elected Obama. Maybe she can do that, but I'm not sure about that. That's one question mark. But then for Republicans is, are you running against Obama and saying, throw the bums out, the usual appeal? You always do a certain amount of that. On the other hand, elections are also about the future, right? Especially when it's a president who we know is leaving office and you're not running against an incumbent. And the final wrinkle in all this is, I don't know what everybody else here thought, but when I watched the Democratic Convention in 2012, I watched that speech Bill Clinton gave on night 3. And it's just, I couldn't, I was just
The chief explainer. Right?
It was just absolutely magnificent. And by the typically Clinton that speech, it kept going, and I kept thinking he's going to, and it kept getting better. I couldn't believe it. And I thought when Obama gave his speech the next night, the Clinton's was so much better. I mean, you look, I mean, he's sort of, and why doesn't Obama just send Bill out on the road for him? So one question in my mind is, and it's a tricky thing for Hillary to work out because of, everything we know about the history of the Clinton years and, the foundation stuff recently that's in the papers is, which president's going to be out there on the stump the most and making the most? Who's the people that we're going to be thinking about when? Is it going to be Obama who goes out as a surrogate and plays a role in the campaign, or is it going to be Bill Clinton? Maybe neither of them. Reagan stayed as far away in '88, both in the primary process and then in the fall campaign with very little exceptions. And of course, Al Gore thinks, in retrospect, it was a big mistake not to use Bill Clinton in 2000. So I think the moving parts of this to me are absolutely fascinating. As I say, we've never seen anything like this, and I have no idea how that's going to play out. But I can see either side botching it badly. But probably the Republicans, because they seem to have a better talent for screwing up. But anyway.
Well, so let me follow up on that. How much will Republicans run against Obama as opposed to Clinton? Let's assume she's the nominee.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my own view in this, but what am I? Is it would be a mistake to run a lot against Obama because he's not on the ballot. But the partisan passions of the party base really wants to make it about Obama, and you've got to satisfy that base, and that's going to be a very tricky thing for someone to work out. And I mean, haven't asked me. I maybe don't want to handicap the field. A person like Rubio is more rhetorically skillful and will do a better job. Walker's a big question mark, and really, we're going to have another Bush-Clinton race? I mean, 10 years ago, David Brooks joked about the rest of my life is going to be Bush-Clinton, Bush-Clinton. Chelsea Clinton will run against George P. Bush someday. It's kind of coming true. It's just, I don't know. I think if Bush is the nominee, it really gets weird.
So the one thing I will say about it is that I think that, I do think that it's a very unusual race, so I will say that. And I think that it's, people have an idea that they really know Hillary Clinton in a way that is just very different. She's not, just another Secretary of State or, in the previous, when the vice presidents ran. She's seen very independently from Obama. So I do think that she will be taken on her own terms, not necessarily as an extension. So I think that will be important. But she also, I think, will be held accountable for everything the Obama administration does. So there's kind of, I would say, a little bit of both happening, which is both fully accepting and owning everything in the Obama administration, but also being very much her own person. And so it is, I think, unusual in that way. And there's one thing that Kathy said that I think shouldn't be lost. Oftentimes people talk about this historic moment because she's a woman, but the fact of the matter is it would be very historic, and you guys will be able to say exactly the history here, but it would be very historic for a Democrat to be able to get, and I can't remember the last time, one of you remember the last time this happened when a Democrat actually became got a third term?
Franklin Roosevelt.
Yes, it's been a while.
Well, you mean a different Democrat, Tom.
Right. Well,
Then you got to go back to Martin Van Buren.
Martin Van Buren.
Yes.
Yes.
Although people always talk about that, but let's note, just to give Al Gore a little shout out here, in 2000, Al Gore got more votes than George W. Bush did. Whatever you think happened in Florida, he was running for Clinton's third term, and he got more votes.
Right.
So I'm not sure it's quite as difficult to win the third term as everybody says it is. But
Yeah.
Just one last thing about separation. And you were saying about Obama's economy. People think of it in those terms, but it's not Obama's economy. It's the economy that's evolved. He got part of his program through, and he couldn't get other parts of it through. But if you look at it and reread his speeches or review them over the last 18 months, they look an awful lot like Hillary's been talking. He has the same criticisms of the state of the economy, the particular problems with it, and I don't see yet much actual substantive difference between Hillary and Barack Obama.
I think it's perceptual, perhaps, and it may be because people stopped listening to what he was saying. At a certain point, you sort of zone out what the guy who's always talking says. And then a new player comes on stage and maybe saying roughly the same thing, but it sounds fresh. And I think that's what she managed to achieve in the first couple of weeks, was a sense that I get it. I get that you don't feel that the economy is rumbling along wonderfully.
And before I go to questions from the audience, Tom, I want to ask you what you said. It's not Obama's economy. I know what you mean by that, but yet isn't it the case that when voters go to the polls, they perceive it as the economy of the party that is in power, that is in the White House, or not?
Absolutely.
So in that sense,
it doesn't matter. We may have had divided party government and gridlock on some other things. The president, as I began with, gets too much credit and too much blame.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, let's go to some questions from the audience here. Has Obama's foreign policy strengthened or weakened our standing in the world? And what do you see regarding his foreign policy initiatives in his remaining time in office? I'm especially interested in the first part of that. Do you, there was much made that when Obama came into office, almost just by not being George W. Bush, he strengthened our standing in the world or our popularity in the world. I think most people think he received the Nobel Prize for not being George W. Bush. So is that a significant accomplishment on Obama? I mean, did he change our standing in the world just by a sort of symbolism? And is that meaningful, or is that sort of washed away now?
I think that, and I will now be I really do believe this, and it's going to sound like I'm a partisan for Hillary Clinton. Of course, I am a partisan for Hillary Clinton. But I think that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton played a very important role in the first 4 years of the Obama presidency, because she did have a lot of repair work to do around the globe in terms of relationship building. And so, people sometimes, particularly the other side, will poke fun at how many countries she's been to and how many hours she spent on the plane. But the fact of the matter is that relationships matter, that particularly when you're in this complicated global world, it makes a big difference to be having those bilateral conversations, those global conversations. And so I think that there was certainly there was a tremendous amount of work to do in terms of the repair work that she personally took on. And I think that Obama now is, he's living in a very complicated world, and it's not, I think that there's been some critique of, whether he's been strong enough, and which I think, I really do think it's going to be very fascinating whether he gets the Iran agreement done, and if he does, I think that changes how we think about his foreign policy. If he doesn't, I think, we are going to feel a lot of insecurity with regard to the Middle East.
And then, of course, there's the enormous unpredictability of foreign policy, right? That something comes up and you don't know what it is until it happens. So, Stephen, do you and you don't have to, but do you see, does he get a benefit for this sort of symbolic change? Did it matter?
Well, I'm not much into symbolic things. I think underneath the symbolism is something potentially interesting and potentially worrying. Interesting. The person who's probably closest to him in certain ways, I think, in the substance of where they think we ought to reorient is, Rand Paul. Right? I think Obama came to office with a view, for very different reasons than Rand Paul, that the U.S. footprint in the world ought to be smaller. I think it's entirely defensible. I actually agree with some of that. I was absolutely with him in staying out of Syria. I did not think the Libyan involvement was a good idea. On the other hand, things are falling apart over there. But the problem is that I think that what is needed from that point of view is it's probably a 10-year process of great strategic design to realign some of the world's alliances and find other countries who are going to be responsible in an intensive way for their own neighborhoods. In the same way that Truman, Acheson, and the post-World War II generation said, we got a big problem with Europe and the Soviet Union, and we got to put together a new architecture for the whole world. And now, the other thing is foreign policy is the hardest thing to see when it's right in front of you. I mean, I've gotten, going back to the Bush years, I've got here and there, I've gotten reports about back channel discussions we've been having with the Iranians. You know, in Switzerland, private citizens, people going, you know, with their badges off and all the rest of that. We've been trying all kinds of things with them and other things. So that's why I say, you know, I always say to people, let's reserve judgment for 10 years until we know what all has gone on here with all of this. Because we really can't know. I think you can criticize what is in front of you and the written agreement and conditions and all that. But so I don't know what all has gone on. And right now, so, you know, Yemen's falling apart. The Saudis are mobilizing or bombing, and other countries are sending in troops. And so I'm watching all that and wondering, have we told the Arab League, or are we thinking about telling the Arab League, you guys need to grow up, and you guys need to sort out that region, because we shouldn't be the policemen of that region. It's costing us too much. It's too problematic for us, right? And I don't know if that's going on. Obama, the standard line on Obama, from conservatives anyway, is that he's not much interested in foreign policy. He's really interested in domestic reform. He wants to be, I think, the fourth great wave of liberal reform. You know, Wilson, Roosevelt, Johnson, Obama, and that's mostly what we've talked about here tonight. Johnson neglected foreign policy, right? I mean, he ignored Europe, ignored Asia, because Vietnam ate him alive. And, you know, if the Middle East completely falls apart in the next year, I think that's going to be very bad for him and a big problem for Hillary. Maybe it won't. Maybe it'll just muddle along the way it is now. But if you have another big Israel-Syria war, I don't know. Actually, Syria's flat on its back. They're not going to go to war with anybody. But so that's very hard to see. But right now, I'm inclined to be very critical of not being serious enough about how he thinks foreign policy ought to change. And my default position is that's because he comes from the sort of the faculty room background. Even his Cairo speech, parts of it were very good, but parts of it was sort of, you know, liberal American guilt about America's role in the world. Whereas I think, you know, there are lots of reasons. I say Rand Paul sketches them out of why we ought to have a smaller footprint that I have some sympathy with. But I think it needs to be a lot more intensive than it's been. And maybe it has been, as I say, we don't know. But, you know, but that's what I think right now.
This is a question we could talk about for an hour, but we'll try to do this briefly. The next one is, what effect have campaign finance law changes had on our political polarization, and how will this impact the presidential election in 2016? Tom, you want to?
I've wasted more time than anyone else on this panel on this very subject.
And all of it bad, but anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
The answer is it will probably have no impact on the outcome of the presidential election. Both parties' candidates will be sufficiently funded that any extra tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars spent or trying to be spent won't make a difference. Down ballot, it could be significant in places. I think the problems that we face have less to do with designed reforms passed by Congress and signed by presidents than by the court's series of decisions, starting with Buckley, that set aside about a third of the initial FECA, and then subsequent steps taken after the passage of McCain-Feingold by the Roberts Court. So we have a system designed by no one. It sort of collapsed under judicial decisions and regulatory misfeasance of not doing their job, and it's a mess. But I'm of the belief that money is not the source of our polarization. It reinforces it at times, but it's by no means the cause of it. We can trace how this happened back through the history of the parties and the interest groups that aligned and the entrepreneurs that brought the party to accept new agendas, and then the money sort of followed afterward. But parties are not hindered in this world. They run most of the non-party money operations known as super PACs. But it's much more problematic for our public life than it is for polarization. I'm embarrassed as an American citizen to see campaigns, the playpens of billionaires, the plutocrats. It's truly unseemly, and And the whole effect of money is to reinforce the inequalities that, or impose more of the economic inequalities onto the political process. So I think it's a huge problem that can't be solved anytime soon, given the court and given the sharp partisan differences on this. And we shouldn't get too focused on this as the mega problem. Lawrence Lessig is wrong. It's not the source of all problems in our politics.
Oh, I'm going to quote you on that to Lawrence.
Would you?
Yeah.
Please do.
Is there a problem? Can I just ask you this one? So there are reports now that Jeb Bush may run his campaign out of a super PAC, sort of farm out his whole campaign, which is therefore non-transparent.
Exactly. It's also illegal. I mean, given what still remains on the statute books and in the court decision and Citizens United, it clearly was the intention that candidates not be able to create such entities that raise unlimited sums and spend money on their behalf, but that it be independent of them. And it's one of the most brazen acts, and it's being followed by others, and that's how it happens. Entrepreneurs push it a little further and see if anyone calls them to account for it. That's really my complaints about money in politics. Not that there's too much or it causes polarization. It's that it's unseemly for a self-respecting democracy to let such huge mega donations to occur, operating really outside the regulatory regime that exists in our politics. It really is the collapse of rule of law and the absence of any real respect for our system of democracy.
We only have time for a couple more questions. So let me.
Neutral on that one.
I dissent from Tom, but he knows that.
Do you want to quickly answer him?
Just one point. I mean, he and I go on. If I were forget sort of the laws and Citizens United and all the rest of that, because I think what's the worst part of this, we probably agree about, operates irrespective of those aspects of things that have dominated our conversation. If I'm a liberal, and actually even as a conservative, but especially if I'm a liberal, I would be very upset about the Wall Street domination of the Democratic Party. I mean, I sometimes joke, can't the billionaires just all be Republicans like they're supposed to be? But I think this is a big problem. They dominate both parties, right? I mean, the sort of carried interest tax loophole the hedge fund guys use to pay 15% income on their taxes on their enormous incomes. Right. Who's the chief defender of that? It's Chuck Schumer's the chief defender of that, right? You know, that's because Wall Street's now very powerful in both parties. I think that's a bad thing. I sort of repaired it. I'll stop with this. I sort of like Winston Churchill's old line, you know, great conservative hero, right? He said, I'd rather see finance less proud and workers more satisfied. I think that's how the second part of it goes. But finance less proud. And so we'll see if that changes on the right. A lot of the Tea Party people don't like Wall Street and the banks, right? Have you noticed that Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party said the same thing about Goldman Sachs? Okay.
Let's actually, we've gone a little long already, so let's make this the last question. It's a good one to end on because it sums up the Obama presidency as we get towards the end of it here. What will be President Obama's biggest long-term legacy? And I'm going to say it's unfair for any of you to say it's too soon to tell.
Yeah.
So what, 20 years from now, looking back at Obama, 30 years from now, what are people going to see about Barack Obama, Stephen?
Obamacare. I mean, I'm not sure it survives in its present form or however the court decides, but I think for reasons that Ann actually talked about, it has planted the idea that we have to have an expanded access to and government provision of health care, and that's going to endure no matter what happens to Obamacare itself, whether it's legislatively changed or the court blows a hole in it.
Ann?
100% agree. Maybe that'll be the only thing we agree on, but I definitely agree on it.
We're going to end on agreement.
And I've already said that, so
Yeah.
I agree with that, yeah.
And Kathy, you think as well?
I'm going to be cantankerous and
Okay.
say that despite the economy and Obamacare, his legacy will be being the first representation of the new America.
And the changing population, changing
Right.
demographics of America.
Right. As the first non-white guy.
By the time we do this again next year, we'll be truly closer to the end of the Obama presidency, and we will look back at the full 8 years. So I hope you will all come back, and we'll do this a year from now. Please join me in thanking the panel.